Professor Wayland, could you please explain? No. Professor Arian will answer all your questions. Please excuse me. A group of students in uniform were left speechless as they watched their professor sprint out of the lecture hall the moment the session ended. They had so many questions about runes and their applications, it felt as if a new world had just been revealed to them. Yet the man responsible for this revelation had no interest in answering their queries or offering advice on rune implementation. Before anyone could stop him, he was already around the corner and out of sight. Professor Wayland seems busy. I wonder if he's conducting research. Probably. Maybe he's already preparing a new lecture. What do you think it'll be about next? Oh, I just can't wait. The group chuckled, their excitement palpable. Meanwhile, the man in question was striding purposefully toward one of the mage towers. His daily obligations were complete, and he only wanted to return home. The lessons he delivered were cobbled together just hours before each class, an afterthought amidst the demands of his work in Albrook. Fortunately, his teaching duties only consumed a few hours, leaving him enough time to borrow books from the headmistress's study to expand his knowledge across various fields. His investigation into the other faculty members was progressing steadily, largely thanks to Professor Arian and the dwarven craftsman. The monitoring devices he'd discreetly deployed had started to yield some intriguing results, which he promptly forwarded to both the headmistress and the enforcement department. While a few individuals had already been apprehended for accepting bribes, nothing groundbreaking had been discovered yet. I think I'll cut my research short, there is just too much work to do, I need to get back into the dungeon and clear those 4 temples. Roland made his way toward the teleportation gate within the fire tower, just as he always did. His associates were still working on fabricating the components for the turret system and the generator room, and it would take some time before everything was ready. In the meantime, he was focused on creating a safe area for people to use the teleportation gate, hoping to involve the Adventurers Guild in the process. The Guildmaster had already agreed in principle, and now they just needed to finalize the contracts. Plans to establish a teleportation gate within the city were also underway. Fortunately, there was no need to construct a separate mage tower or develop a new tower spirit for this purpose, Sebastian was already in place. The tower spirit's computing power was more than sufficient to manage both Roland's personal gate and the 2 nearby ones. Additionally, creating a gate with a fixed waypoint was far simpler and consumed less power than a gate requiring constant adjustments from a tower spirit. With these thoughts in mind, Roland continued on his way. However, just as he was about to enter the mage tower to return home, his helmet started beeping. Curious about the unexpected alert, he quickly glanced at the message. To his surprise, it reported the reappearance of 2 individuals who had been missing for some time. Those 2, he thought. I thought they said they'd take the ship back. Did they change their minds? Through one of the runic cameras, he spotted the pair, 2 of his associates, who also happened to be siblings of his wife, Elydia, causing a commotion at the institute. He had provided them with a temporary emblem to grant access to the facility in case they ever needed it, but he hadn't expected them to actually use it. The 2 proclaimed their intent to travel across the kingdom as platinum-ranked adventurers, leaving Roland to assume they'd be gone for some time, even up to a year. He couldn't help but shake his head as he observed the scene. Armand was up to his usual antics, gesturing animatedly, while Lobelia stood nearby, rolling her eyes in exasperation. However, Roland noticed the dark circles under their eyes. Clearly, their journey hadn't gone as smoothly as they might have hoped. Did things not go as they expected? They look a bit thinner. Roland had to stop himself from entering the mage tower to head back home. Instead, he turned on his heel and began walking toward the Institute's central plaza, where Armand and Lobelia were causing a stir. Whatever had brought them back so abruptly, it was bound to be annoying. It was probably in his best interest to defuse this situation before people started asking more questions. The institute grounds were as bustling as ever. Students moved in clusters, animatedly discussing theories and strategizing for their upcoming assignments. A few staff members nodded respectfully as Roland passed, though most avoided direct eye contact. His reputation as the enigmatic deputy professor with a notoriously short temper had made him both a figure of awe and apprehension. As he neared his destination, Armand's booming voice cut through the ambient chatter. And then I punched that Drake right in the jaw, and it popped right off. A collective gasp followed. Oh! And what happened next? Ha, listen up, this is the fun part. When Roland arrived, he found a small crowd gathered around Armand and Lobelia. The institute, populated primarily by the sheltered children of nobles and merchants, rarely hosted rowdy adventurers, making the siblings an irresistible spectacle. Armand, with his natural charisma and rugged demeanor, had captivated the young mage ladies, who hung on his every word. His disheveled appearance, and a notable lack of proper attire only seemed to enhance his appeal. Lobelia, in contrast, had drawn a circle of wide-eyed young men. As a young half-elf, she was strikingly beautiful in her own right. Combined with her status as a powerful Tier 3 class holder, she exuded a certain allure that stirred something primal in the gathered youths. They were clearly eager to secure her services, or perhaps just her attention before the opportunity slipped away. "You're a platinum adventurer, right? How much to hire you as my personal bodyguard?" one of them asked eagerly. "Hey, Edward, back off. I saw her first." Another interjected, his tone dripping with indignation. "Ha, as if." The first retorted, glaring at his rival. The escalating competition was as transparent as it was comical, and Lobelia seemed to take it all in stride, her lips curving into a faintly amused smile. Roland approached the scene with a purposeful stride, his eyes narrowing as he took in the crowd that had gathered around Armand and Lobelia. He could hear the students' exaggerated excitement and chatter, but what stood out to him was the disheveled appearance of his wife's siblings. They looked worse for wear, their clothes torn and dirty, and the exhaustion visible in their faces. He couldn't help but let out a deep sigh. This wasn't exactly the reception he had planned for them, but it was typical of Armand to get into the spotlight in the most inconvenient of ways. Without missing a beat, Roland walked directly up to the group, his presence cutting through the clamor like a sharp blade. The students paused, some snapping to attention at the sight of their professor. Roland's reputation preceded him, and it was no surprise that the crowd quickly began to disperse or at least move to the side. "I'm really seen as a villain, hey, but not quite." While many of the young mages backed away, they didn't stray too far. Instead, they lingered, as if expecting something to unfold. Perhaps they were hoping for a spectacle, watching their infamous full mithril professor confront the two platinum adventurers. Maybe, just maybe, they were hoping for a battle to erupt so they could enjoy a thrilling show. However, as Roland drew near, both Armand and Lobelia instantly recognized him. "Wayland." Lobelia was the first to call out to him, her voice laced with annoyance. She quickly slipped away from the group as the teenage boy spread out, positioning herself at his side. It was clear she was happy to see him. He wasn't sure what the two had been through, but this wasn't the place to discuss it. Now that they were here, he could take them back home, which was probably the main reason they had come. "Wayland, my friend, you found us, just wait until you hear this, you won't believe what happened to us." Armand on the other hand seemed to enjoy the attention of these young ladies. It was as if he wanted to tell him all about his recent adventures while all of these people were listening. Roland wasted no time. His hand shot out and grabbed both Armand and Lobelia by their arms, firmly but not harshly. "You two just come with me, don't talk." Roland yanked Armand and Lobelia out of the crowd, ignoring the murmurs and whispers from the students. The buzz of excitement quickly turned into quiet murmuring as the full mithril professor led the siblings away. "Wait, wait!" Armand protested as he was yanked along. Even though he was larger than Roland, his body was being yanked as if he was a young boy being punished by his father. "Not here. Whatever nonsense you've gotten yourselves into, we'll talk about it somewhere private." Armand gave a sheepish grin, but Lobelia simply sighed, grateful for the intervention. As they moved through the campus grounds, Roland kept a firm grip on both of them. Students parted like waves before them as he headed straight for the Fire Mage Tower. His work for the day was done, and he had no desire to deal with more rumors spreading. Once inside, he loosened his grip and cast a stern look at the two troublemakers. "Come, I'll get you back to Albrook. You shouldn't stay here too long." Roland glanced around. A few curious eyes were still watching them, and he knew this was far from ideal. While his involvement in Robert's case was widely known, he didn't want anyone digging into Armand and Lobelia as it would inevitably lead them to Albrook. He wasn't sure what these two had been up to, but there was always the risk that the Count would uncover the truth about what had happened after the trial. "He's always this grumpy, hey." "Shut up, Armand!" Lobelia hissed back, elbowing him in the ribs. "Ow, what was that for? Can you read the room already?" "Ah!" Armand seemed to have finally realized something and gave Roland a wink. Lobelia, on the other hand, had known from the start to stay silent. She simply nodded as the two followed Roland, who guided them toward the teleportation gate chamber. In situations like this, Roland's newly gained status proved invaluable. No one questioned him, and no one dared to inquire about his two companions. The mages in charge of the teleportation gate quietly stepped aside, allowing him to activate it without interference. Moments later, the three of them walked through the gate, arriving at their destination inside his workshop. "What is this place, and what's with this strange white light?" Armand asked as he was the first to break the silence. "This is inside my workshop. I suppose it has changed slightly since the last time you were here." Roland responded as he noticed Armand glancing curiously around the lower workshop. There was more equipment now compared to when they last used the teleportation gate, and the chamber was well lit. Previously, they had moved quickly from the elevator area to the gate without being given much time to look around. While he trusted the two, he had already scanned them for any potential parasites or shape-shifting abilities. They appeared clean, but it was always better to be cautious. "Master, initializing scan. No outside influences have been detected in the runic workshop." A calm, mechanical voice announced and prompted Armand to raise an eyebrow. "Oh? What's that thing?" A talking orb of light. Sebastian, his artificial tower spirit, floated forward, emitting a soft, steady glow. "It's something mages like to call an artificial tower spirit, but it's slightly different from those." Roland replied while knowing that Armand probably had no idea what he was talking about. "Oh, is it like a summoned spirit? Does it follow orders? Can it answer some questions?" "I suppose so, but let's not change the subject. What happened to the two of you? I thought you wanted to tour through the kingdom for some more." Roland finally posed the question, bringing up the issue that had been on his mind. The two before him looked as though they were on the run and hadn't slept in days. Given that they were still Tier 3 class holders, there were only a few plausible scenarios that could have led to such a state. While Roland often encountered people above his level, this didn't mean such individuals were common in the wider world. The kingdom was vast, and each city typically housed only a handful of such elites. Could the Count have sent his people to capture them? Or did they encounter the cult again? The cult had always been a persistent threat, having already made several attempts to hinder him. Thanks to the church's presence in Albrook, he could sleep soundly at night. But if the cult discovered that two people close to him were wandering the kingdom unguarded, he could easily imagine them sending operatives to infect the pair with their insidious parasites. Ah, it was a grand adventure. We visited new cities, fought new monsters, and drank new liquor. Truly the best time I've had in ages, isn't that right, Lobelia? Yeah, sure, until someone had to ruin it all. I told you to keep your hands to yourself. And what did you go and do? Well, it's not my fault the ladies can't get enough of me. You can't blame me for what happened. It was just a moment of passion." Roland narrowed his eyes when looking at Armand, who flicked his hair. "Moment of passion? I don't understand." Lobelia groaned and buried her face in her hands, clearly exasperated. This idiot had an affair with the daughter of a nobleman. Roland flinched as he heard Lobelia speak. Nobles were meticulous about their engagements and social arrangements. If the young lady in question was already promised to another nobleman or waiting for a formal arrangement, this situation could spell disaster. If rumors spread that she had been involved with a rowdy adventurer like Armand, her reputation and life could be irreparably damaged. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Whatever noble family they had encountered would likely go to great lengths to punish the man who had seduced their daughter. The real concern was the status of this noble, as higher-ranking houses would pose far greater threats. "Does this noble or noble house have a name?" Roland asked, his tone steady. "I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was a baron." Armand replied with a shrug. A wave of relief washed over Roland at the mention of a baron. While his own father held the same rank, few barons could compare to his family's resources and influence. A lesser noble house would likely have limited means, fewer Tier 3 elites, for instance, to send on a prolonged chase to this island. He exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose as he processed the situation. "So, let me get this straight. You had a fling with a baron's daughter during your travels, and now they've sent people after you." Armand shrugged, his grin as carefree as ever. "That's one way of putting it. But hey, it's not my fault her dad doesn't approve of her taste in men like me." Lobelia groaned, her patience wearing thin as she watched her brother grin smugly, acting as though he hadn't done anything wrong. With an exasperated sigh, she instinctively swatted him on the arm before speaking. "Armand, for once in your life, could you stop treating everything like a joke? This isn't just some tavern brawl you can charm your way out of. She's right. If a noble house has decided to target you, this could escalate quickly. Even a baron can pull strings to send bounty hunters or hire mercenaries. You're lucky you made it back to Albrook in one piece. Armand raised his hands in mock surrender, the grin still plastered across his face. Relax, Wayland. We're still alive and fine. We just had to run for a bit, but everything is fine now. Roland frowned as Armand started laughing but nodded slightly. For now, it was best for them to lay low in Albrook. Even if the noble managed to track them down here, there wouldn't be much they could do as both Armand and Lobelia were under the employ of Arthur, a duke's son. A bit. Lobelia snapped, crossing her arms and glaring at her brother. You mean running from town to town for a week, barely sleeping, and fending off hired thugs counts as a bit to you? She raised her voice, her frustration mounting, while Roland instinctively took a step back. A fling with a noble's daughter was bad enough, but at least they were in Albrook now, a city where people on the run seemed to inevitably converge. Roland sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose as Armand and Lobelia continued to bicker. He didn't have the energy for this. After a full day of lectures, runic schematics, and managing student antics, his mind was already overtaxed. The last thing he needed was yet another problem involving nobles. Well, at least they are back here now, that's one less thing to worry about. Though they bickered, for some reason a smile crept on his face. While time was tight, it felt like such things were not bad from time to time. Inside a silent chamber lit by torches, a man stood still. Sweat was visible on his toned body, but his wrinkled face betrayed his true age. The man stood before the imposing slab of mithril, his stance relaxed yet purposeful. Torches lining the walls flickered, their light glinting off the gleaming surface of the nearly indestructible metal. A silence hung heavy in the chamber, broken only by the soft rustle of his clothing as he shifted his footing. The sword in his hand was no ordinary weapon. Its slender, shining blade bore intricate magic symbols that pulsed faintly, their light dancing like the embers of a dying fire. He raised it in a single, fluid motion, his focus narrowing until the entire world seemed to consist of him and the slab before him. Taking a measured breath, he slid his foot forward, his body coiling like a spring. The next moment, he unleashed a strange thrust, a motion that seemed almost effortless, yet carried an overwhelming force. The blade pierced the mithril with a sharp and resonant sound, the vibrations rippling through the chamber. A moment later, the result of his strike became clear. A clean, gaping hole punched straight through the mithril slab, the edges smooth and polished as if crafted by a master artisan. The man's arm remained extended for a moment, the blade of his fencing sword shimmering faintly as residual energy dissipated into the air. He stepped back, lowering his sword and exhaling deeply, his sharp eyes inspecting his handiwork. The old man exhaled, lowering the blade. The weight of the strike was absent from his posture, his form as balanced and composed as it had been before the attack. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, studied the slab. Satisfied, he took a step back, allowing himself a small smile. That makes 6. Maybe I should switch to adamantium. He murmured, glancing toward a row of identical mithril slabs, each marked by a similar head-sized hole. Most of them were broken and crumbled, weakened by the multiple punctures they had endured. Just then, the chamber door creaked open, and a butler entered, dressed impeccably in black and white. The man turned to face him, his silvery white hair catching the flickering torchlight, his upper lip adorned with a gentlemanly mustache. Your Grace! The butler intoned, bowing deeply. A message has arrived from the Adventurers Guild. I see, is it that time again? The butler nodded silently and presented a letter to his master. The man didn't bother to dress, instead, he simply grabbed the neatly prepared letter, which had been offered to him on a plate of silvery metal. The envelope was peculiar, embellished with the depiction of a crowned stag. After cutting it open with the provided letter opener, the mustached man began to read. The butler remained there, his head lowered while the man played around with his mustache. After a minute he placed the letter down and nodded. Good, make the preparations and send out the invitations, we still have some time. Yes, Your Grace. It was clear that the butler knew what his master wished. He gave a slight bow, his hands neatly clasped as he retreated from the chamber. His polished shoes tapped softly against the stone floor, the sound fading as he exited through the heavy oaken door. The old man remained behind, his gaze lingering on the mithril slabs. With a sigh, he sheathed the slender fencing sword into its ornate scabbard and turned toward the chamber's single, narrow window. Stepping closer, he pulled aside the thick velvet drapes, allowing the pale moonlight to illuminate his face. His expression was unreadable, his sharp eyes narrowing as they focused on the distant horizon. Beyond the sprawling grounds of the castle, with its meticulously manicured gardens and towering battlements, loomed a shadowed, ominous peak. A volcano. Its jagged form dominated the landscape, black smoke curling lazily from its summit, while a faint orange glow illuminated the edges. The sight was both majestic and foreboding, the volcano's sheer scale dwarfing the massive city below. The old man's lips pressed into a thin line as he studied it, his fingers drumming against the window frame. His gaze lingered on the strange greyish fog beginning to envelop it. Now that I have the full scans, this area will probably be the best spot for the teleportation chamber. The rocks aren't too hard, and there's enough foliage to hide the entrance from the monsters. Roland nodded as he placed his hand on the dungeon wall. Before leaving this floor, he had left behind a small hole along with several hovering golems. Even in his absence, they had spent days floating through the air, scanning every nook and cranny of the level. Thanks to their efforts, he had discovered a few hidden locations leading to treasure, one of them conveniently close to this spot. These will work nicely to help power the teleportation gate, though it won't be enough to sustain all of the turrets. Lucky to find a small monocrystal pocket. His plan to bring his automatons here to farm the temples was still hampered by the problem of power consumption. However, if he could establish the gate, he could link it temporarily to his workshop and allow him to travel back and forth with no delay. For now, he was focused on expanding the area and he wasn't working alone. Snoof. Agni, your nose is covered in dirt. Woof. Agni was a great help when it came to digging. His ruby crystal woven form had sharp claws that tore through the hard rock as if it were butter. With Agni's assistance, Roland could concentrate on reinforcement. Just like with the door leading into this dungeon, encasing everything in metal would prevent the walls from fully fusing back together. As Agni dug, Roland systematically took out the metal plates he had prepared earlier. Each plate was fitted with clasps, designed to lock securely onto the others. A simple rectangular is usually the best. It didn't look impressive, but it worked. Soon, Roland had carved out a space roughly 10 meters long, 5 meters wide, and 2.5 meters high, just enough to fit a small teleportation gate. A faint light radiated from the metal plates, which, once carefully positioned, locked into place with surprising force. Each panel was inscribed with runes, their intricate designs serving to stabilize the structure and channel mana into the teleportation gate. Good work, Agni. That should be wide enough. Stand guard and take care of any undead that wander over here. Woof. Agni shifted into his flaming form, his fiery aura casting flickering light onto the dungeon walls as he stood guard. Meanwhile, Roland continued working, his thoughts branching out beyond the immediate task. With Armand and Lobelia back, the two could focus on leveling up and gaining more power. Arthur also seemed receptive to the school project Roland had proposed, and even Elydia appeared to be considering it. Funding everything was a concern, but once this endeavor was complete, he felt confident he'd have access to enough resources to ease those worries for a long time. I suppose, I'll fill this out later and now I should focus on clearing this level. Roland nodded in satisfaction as the space had been drilled out and reinforced with his metal plates, forming a sturdy, box-like structure. He hadn't brought a fully functional teleportation gate with him, but once he finished his preparations, he would assemble it on site. Once the gate was operational, he could transport the turret materials through it and install them on the dungeon ceiling. The turrets he had previously installed were still intact but remained depot-ward due to the lack of batteries. This new setup would address that issue and allow him to secure the area more effectively. Once everything was completed, Roland placed a large rock at the entrance. He had designed the room so that the dungeon would naturally close itself around it, sealing the space inside. The rock was a temporary measure. Later, he would construct a proper entrance after clearing the floor. Well then, Agni, which one do you want to tackle first, the Wind Temple or the Water Temple? Awoo. Not a fan of water, hey. Roland watched as Agni snorted, his ruby-hued muzzle wrinkling in clear disapproval. All right then, the Wind Temple it is. Let's see what surprises this one has for us. He activated his glider once more, soaring toward the Green Temple while Agni padded along below, navigating a path that led there. The closer Roland got to the Green Temple, the more intense the air currents became. The winds whipped violently around the structure, carrying with them a faint, eerie howl that reverberated through the cavern. The carvings on the temple walls depicted fierce storms, twisting tornadoes, and figures cloaked in flowing robes that seemed to merge with the winds. The symbol at the apex was a spiraling vortex that emitted a soft, greenish glow, pulsating with elemental energy. As Roland approached the temple, his visor lit up with warnings about the intensifying mana currents. Looks like the winds get stronger the closer you get to the top. This could be a problem for anyone trying to scale it the conventional way. His glider buckled under the wind pressure, but he managed to stabilize it by surrounding himself with a shield. He had two options, either enter from the top, as he had done with the Flame Temple, or go through the bottom the proper way. With the turrets disabled and their rune batteries no longer powering them, he would have to rely on his own mana while maneuvering mid-flight. Based on his calculations, this was feasible, but he wanted to experience at least one entry the normal way, to gauge how well he could manage it. Thus, he decided to land at the bottom and waited for Agni to catch up. Once there, they were greeted by a few undead monsters. The undead patrolling the Green Temple's entrance were unlike the fiery skeletons from the Red Temple. These creatures appeared to be animated by wind energy, their forms semi-ethereal and cloaked in swirling, greenish mist. Their skeletal figures were thin and elongated, giving them a spectral, unsettling appearance. Stormborn Infernal Skeleton Axeman L193. That's certainly a new type, but a skeleton is still a skeleton. Agni. Woof. His woven partner jumped forward, his body surrounded by radiant flame energy, the bane of any undead. Even though these monsters had elemental affinities and resistances, all undead were weak against holy mana which he and his wolf could generate. From Agni's mouth a ray of holy fire energy erupted. The ray of holy fire engulfed the nearest stormborn undead, the greenish mist swirling around its form briefly resisting before being overpowered. The skeleton crumbled with a haunting wail, the corrupted energy animating it dispersing into the ether. Agni's prowess was clear as he moved gracefully, dispatching the undead with precise strikes, his flames leaving nothing behind but faint scorch marks on the ground. Once the creatures were defeated, they were rewarded accordingly. Just as the molten infernal skeletons had dropped ignition ore, these monsters dropped a wind elemental variant. While the armor surrounding them initially appeared to be composed of wind energy, once the monsters were defeated, it began shifting into a solid form, one that was green in color and somewhat brittle. This gay light isn't good on its own, but if fused with a harder metal. After pocketing the spoils, Roland took this time to evaluate the entrance. The Green Temple's gates loomed tall, carved with intricate depictions of whirlwinds and storms. Faint green light pulsed from the cracks in the stone, almost as if the temple itself were alive and breathing. Roland approached cautiously, his visor highlighting the presence of runic symbols embedded in the gates. This looks simple enough, but... He was sure that he could affect these runes with his abilities, but there was an opening on the side. It seemed to be a perfect fit for the elemental block he retrieved from the other temple and was clearly meant to be socketed here to enter it. It was clear the dungeon wanted adventurers to explore all the temples to gain access to their counterparts. However, he wasn't one to follow a dungeon's design willingly. I could brute force this, but that might trigger the traps. Not ideal. After placing his hand over the socket, he scanned it for potential problems. His visor flickered, displaying information about the device in front of him. He immediately noticed a critical detail: slotting the wrong block into the socket would trigger a trap, summoning several monsters from within the temple. After deciding to proceed cautiously, he retrieved the elemental block from his storage space. It regains its qualities once it's out in the open. This rectangular artifact, taken from the Flame Temple, had lost all its properties as soon as it was placed in his spatial storage rune. However, once reconnected to the dungeon floor, Roland could see it drawing mana from the surroundings, gradually regaining its fiery power. Best to take it slow and not waste too much energy on traps. I'll do it by the book. He nodded and inserted the block into the Wind Temple, which reacted instantly. The runes began to shimmer, and the passage forward slowly started to open. Roland used this time to analyze the process. In the future, it might be possible to create other ways to enter this space without him needing to be there. Now then, let's go, Agni. Woof. The two moved forward and entered the temple. Inside, they encountered winding corridors with a sparse amount of monsters, some undead, others of the elemental variety, just like in the previous temple. The fights were uneventful, and with the help of his armor, Roland was able to scan the passages for potential traps and hidden chambers. Just like with the fire elementals, the wind elementals, swirling vortexes with green orbs within, provided them with a new resource, high-quality wind crystals. They use these to generate high winds for airships, but I wonder if I could use them for something else. These green crystals emitted a humming sound along with a cool breeze. While it was probably not enough to power a windmill, there were ways to enhance wind spells using these crystals. Like the flame ones, they could be sold to alchemists for a lot of gold. This was why he was here, to earn more money and help facilitate his future endeavors, which were starting to cost too much. The sound of rushing wind grew louder as Roland and Agni moved within the wind temple, the gusts becoming more violent with each step. The wind energy inside blew at them with ever-increasing intensity, which the elemental monsters within were immune to. It seemed as if the very air itself was alive, shifting and swirling around them, as though the temple were breathing. Nevertheless, they continued with their journey, slaying monsters, disabling traps, and finding hidden treasure in hidden chambers, which added up nicely. Once they reached the top, the temperature dropped and the faintest hints of storm clouds began to gather in the temple's high, vaulted ceilings. Previously, when it came to the Flame Temple, he had broken through the upper barrier and ignored all the monsters inside. But now, after taking the more conventional path, he triggered a defensive reaction and found himself facing what appeared to be a mini-boss. This hadn't happened when he was at the Flame Temple, and he suspected that taking the more straightforward approach might actually be simpler than cutting through from the top. High Elemental Storm Eagle L197. The monster guarding the wind elemental block materialized before them. The Storm Eagle's massive wings spread wide, its feathers shimmering with crackling energy. Its talons gleamed like steel, and its sharp, predatory eyes locked onto Roland and Agni with a piercing, elemental rage. The very air around it seemed to ripple with the force of its presence, the wind spiraling into chaotic gusts, swirling in impossible directions. Agni, you might want to hang out in the back for this one. Woo. Agni seemed disappointed but understood the unfavorable matchup. His divine flames would be useless against this elemental bird, as it was not an undead monster. Roland, on the other hand, stepped forward, a large hammer materializing in his hand. He had decided to test his lesser-used skills. Typically, he relied on runic spells and the power of his golems, but the creature before him seemed like an ideal sparring partner for his current abilities, a rare opportunity to practice real combat techniques.